Well, hey, good morning, everybody. Good to see all of you guys. If you are new here with us, my name is John Wagler, and I have the honor to be part of this Hill City team, and so thankful that you are here. We are in week number 3 of this series called Never Thirst Again, where we're looking at this story from John chapter 4. Now, John was one of the closest followers of Jesus and wrote a lot about him, and he specifically included this story for a reason. And that reason was to allow us to see how Jesus steps into some cultural norms and some things that were accepted, and he sets a completely different example. And so when we look at this story, we're going to see that if we really want to follow Jesus, then we follow his example of how he interacted with this Samaritan woman. Now, there was a lot of conflict that was between Jewish people and Samaritans at that time, and Jewish folks would try and essentially oust them, and Samaritans didn't like the Jews either. And so this interaction where Jesus actually speaks to a woman, which would have also not been culturally acceptable, becomes this kind of pivotal point with how these disciples begin to see how they're supposed to interact with people that aren't like them, and to get outside of their kind of normal way of thinking. And so the first week when we looked at this story, we talked about how cultural norms don't actually quench our thirst for a meaningful life. And then last week, we talked about how important it is to be present, and that one of the things that is so important is we look at the pace of our lives, and the pace of our life really determines whether how we have a really authentic presence in someone else's life. And so today I want to talk about something about participating, and so we live in a world of participation awards, and is it everything that's wrong with young people? Probably, but but I have a strong distaste for this, but my daughter, Nevaeh, she came home one day with this award, and she came home and she was doing this after-school jump roping thing that they had at elementary school, and so she's like, "Dad, I was the best jump roper in the class," and she's holding this award. I was like, "Vea," I was like, way to go, way to get after it, right? And I knew she could jump rope well and everything, and obviously you're proud if your kid's the best at anything, so I was like, that's cool. And so we keep talking, I was like, but you did miss 2 out of the 6 classes. That's pretty cool that you were able to overcome that. And then she sets the thing down and goes into a room, and I look at it, and it was just like a participation award. And so I take it, and I was like, either she's lying or something else. So I go up to her, and I was like, Vea, I was like, did everybody get one of these? And she goes, well, yes. I was like, well, how did you know you were the best? She's like, well, the teacher told me. I was like, okay, well, that's good. I was like, but everyone got one of these participation awards, right? And she's like, well, yes. And she goes, we're going to burn it, aren't we? And so something is sinking into our kids, and so, which is good. And so, but we live in this world where, you get a trophy for everything, and your participation award for everything. And I actually wonder if this is bled over into how we view our life with Jesus. That we think I participated a little bit. I kind of do it. I'm kind of involved. I kind of attend. I kind of get, it's Christmas. I'm here, right? We get these little things, and we think, is that enough? And we're trying to use Jesus for our own good. And so I think this bleed over can happen. Actually, in the story, we begin to see how there is this difference between, you see people who are consumers versus people that contribute. And that's the main thought for today, really, is that Jesus wants us to be known for what we contribute, not for what we consume. And I want to take a look at some different factors that bleed into this. There's this guy, Mark Sayers, who's one of my favorite pastors. He's out of Australia. He's got a brilliant mind. I'm reading one of his books, and he talks about this difference between cultural Christianity, consumer Christianity, and then actually following Jesus. And he's got this cultural Christianity, which is that it's just a part of the fabric of a community or of a country. And so for our case, it would be when people say we are a Christian nation, right? That's a cultural statement that someone would say that. And it makes Christianity kind of part of the culture in general. You might go down south, you might hear something about the Bible Belt, that people just go to church because out of habit. It's part of the culture, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually following Jesus. Now, some people, yes, of course, but it doesn't actually necessarily mean that. There's part of the culture. Then he says this, there's a difference between that and then also consumer Christianity. And he has this quote in there that I just really like that I read the other day. He says this, that consumer Christianity is a form of cultural Christianity that compromises the cross with the self rather than a flag, and then it mixes the worship of God with the worship of opinions and personal autonomy, low commitment, and opinion over responsibility. So he's like, there's this difference. There's a difference between being a contributor and a consumer, and that when you're a consumer, you're not actually really going all in, that you're just kind of waiting and seeing. And so I want to take a look at that as we continue this story in the next stage of this interaction between Jesus and this woman, because the disciples are now coming back in. So in verse 27, it says this: the disciples came back and they were shocked to find Jesus, that's the him, talking to a woman, but none of them had the nerve to ask, "What do you want with her?" or "Why are you talking to her?" The woman left her water jar beside the well and ran back to the village, telling everyone, "Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could he possibly be the Messiah?" So the people came streaming from the village to see him. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging Jesus, "Rabbi, eat something." And Jesus replies, "I have the kind of food you know nothing about." So the disciples asked, "Did someone bring him food while we were gone?" And Jesus says, "My nourishment comes from doing the will of God, who sent me, and from finishing his work. You know the saying, 4 months between planting and harvest, but I say, wake up and look around. The fields are already ripe for harvest. The harvesters are paid good wages, and the fruit they harvest is people brought to eternal life. What joy awaits both the planter and the harvester alike. You know the saying, one plants and another harvests, and it's true. And I sent you to harvest where you didn't plant. Others had already done the work, and now you will get to gather the harvest." So I want to take a look at some of the ways and why it's so important for us to begin to see what stage that we're in. Are we a contributor or a consumer? And maybe some things that actually bring about those stages. And so I want to highlight 4 quick things about what might contribute or cause us to be a consumer. There is a part of this where we all have to go through a consumer phase. So whether or not you are here just trying to figure this Jesus thing out, or you've been around for a while, there are elements where we go through consumer phases. But I want us to look at some causes. And the first cause is this: that you might have some immaturity. You might be stuck in this consumer mindset about their faith in Jesus just because of immaturity. Like and this is part of like growing, right? It's part of the process. You might just not view things the right way, or maybe you're a little selfish in how you view your relationship with Jesus, or maybe it's all about you. Whatever it is, like there's this element where you're just a little immature in this process right now, and so it makes you a consumer. It just makes you just want to be out for you with this. The second part is a lack of commitment. A lack of commitment could cause us to be a consumer. You might be more committed to work than you are to Jesus. You might be more committed to your kid's academic schedule than to Jesus. You might be more committed to a kid's youth stuff, youth sports, than to Jesus. You might be more committed to working out than you are to Jesus. You might, whatever it is, start taking a look at some things like, hey, part of the reason I might be stuck in this consuming phase is that in reality, I'm more committed to other things than my faith. And so that will make us a consumer. The third thing is that Jesus isn't real to you yet. You might have been around it, and maybe even for a long time, but it hasn't captured your soul yet. Jesus hasn't grabbed you yet. You will notice the difference between when Jesus kind of is real and when he's not. You will have a noticeable difference in the way you think, in the way you act, in the way you perceive life. That's when Jesus is real, when it's real to you. It might have, that's part of my story. Guaranteed it's a part of a lot of your stories, that you might have known about Jesus or been involved about Jesus, but man, when it was real, then you saw it didn't make you perfect. It just made it was real, and everything wanted to change because of that. And then the fourth thing is you might just simply be in an exploring phase, which is fine. You're trying to figure out this whole Jesus thing. You're here today because someone invited you, or maybe even flirting with someone, and you think this is the only way I can maybe get on board there. And or whatever it is, you're just here because you're just kind of exploring all this, and that's okay. There's a consumeristic phase about this to just see, is this real? Do I want this? Am I really interested in this whole Jesus thing? And so those are kind of the causes that can make us be a consumer, but we really want to be contributors. But here's what happens. We get stuck in some of these things, and this consumerist mindset starts coming out of us. And I want to highlight 2 very important things around the consumeristic mindset. And the first thing is this, that a consumer mindset makes us feel entitled. A consumer mindset makes us feel entitled. And let me just say this too. Whenever the word entitlement comes out, it's been reserved. It started reserved for millennials, and now, coming down to Gen Zers, but let me just say this. This is a cross-generational term, all right? You will find people in their 50s and 60s and 70s are entitled to. So this is not just like locked in just for young people, but entitlement is interesting because of what it does within us. We think we're always deserved something, but we see in verse 27 with the disciples that there's some entitlement there. They come up on this scene, and when you think about entitlement, it's like this idea of like, oh, I deserve something. So for them, in the culture that they lived in, men had a lot of power over women, and they felt entitled to certain things. And so as they're approaching Jesus and they see him and talking to this woman, their first thought is, how dare he? Or how dare she interact with Jesus? And it's like, whoa. Why is he doing this? Like, this is supposed to be our thing, interacting with him. And so it sets out against this idea of their cultural norms. Why is that? Why did they experience that? It's because up until this point, the followers of Jesus have really just been consuming him. They've been listening to his teachings, they've been seeing his miracles, they've been walking with him, but they didn't fully believe in him yet. So he wasn't actually real yet. And so they're in this consuming phase with him of just trying to be like, oh, he's interesting, he's teaching this. Wow, it's pretty cool. He just did that miracle. Wow, that's crazy. Never heard that before. Like, there's certain things, or seen that before, like there's certain things happening, but they're still consuming all of him. And so inherently with that, then, as they're consuming, when they come up in a situation with the Samaritan, of course they're going to be hesitant. Of course they're going to kind of buy into some of the cultural norms that were at play there. And so that's how they begin to engage with this woman. But she's not a consumer, she's a contributor. Do you see the difference? And this is crazy part of the story. Jesus was real to her. How do we know that? Because her whole life turns around like that. She goes from wondering and like hearing him explain certain things and just, why are you here at this well, and why are we drinking water together, and all this other stuff, how dare, like, I know, like, Jews aren't supposed to talk to Samaritan women and all this other stuff, that all of a sudden she is running back to everyone in verse 28, telling everyone, come and see what has happened here. She has now moved into being a contributor. Like, she is a part of the movement. Why? Because Jesus is real to her. And it changed everything. She didn't feel entitled to something. She didn't feel like, interesting, Jesus, I believe in who you are, and I think you're real to me, and I'm just going to sit at your feet and listen to you teach, not do anything else about it, but occasionally come here and listen to you, and if you do a miracle, that's great. I'll be like, yay, Jesus, but I'm not going to actually contribute to the whole process of what you're doing. She doesn't do that. She leaves this moment. She actually leaves Jesus, and she goes back into the people that were around there. Like, you've got to come and see what this person is doing and what he has told me. He's moved away from this idea of being a consumer and into being a contributor. See, when we are a consumer, we become entitled. And that entitlement, here's what it will inherently do. It'll make us self-focused and we'll lack grit. When we're entitled, we don't want to work from the bottom up. When we're entitled, we don't want to do the hard work. When we're entitled, we don't want to go through the process. When we're entitled, we want to blame other people for our lack of growth. When we're entitled, we don't want the grind that happens, or to struggle, or that something might cost us something, because we're entitled to something. But Jesus actually pushes us in such a different direction with all of this. We're not entitled to anything. Actually, when we start following Jesus, we're giving up everything, right? We aren't entitled to that. We're giving up everything. And so this whole idea then moves in a different direction, but entitlement will keep us in this self-focused mindset. One of the things that is a term that I heard a couple weeks ago, and I can't even remember where I heard it. I just thought it was funny. But they were describing people now that say they're activists, but they don't actually do anything. They just click a button. Right? They don't actually do anything, and like they'll post about it, whatever, but their life hasn't changed. They're not generous about anything, whatever, and they call them slacktivists. And so I just thought it was funny. But I think that's what we do with our Christianity. We can be consumeristic, and we can just be slackers around it, but then we can proclaim that we're following him. And we sit idly by, and we do these little things to act like we're actually involved in contributing, but we're actually just consuming. And so this entitlement thing starts rearing its ugly head everywhere we go. Like, listen, you are entitled to an opinion, but here's a shocker, and I know this, but it doesn't mean that you're right. But that's the stage that we live in. You can't, there's no possibility you could be wrong. our youth pastor, Corey, and I were having a talk about this, and we were just joking around one day, and he was asking me, he goes, what do white people say about this? And I was like, do I ask you what do all black people think? And so like we kind of go back and forth, and we were just joking because I was like, man, we can't speak on behalf of all white people, and you can't speak on behalf of all black people, right? It's just because someone is one way or another doesn't mean that you're right. And we do this stuff all the time. And so it's important for us then wait, hold on a second. I am entitled to my opinion, but man, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be right. Well, so Jesus is calling into this kind of thought process and this saying like, hey, you got to be a contributor to this. You can't just consume all of it. You can't be a slacker around all of this. You've got to get involved. If you want to see entitlement in its finest form, you should coach a youth team. And because this is why I say it's cross-generational. Like I literally just recently had a conversation with a parent, and in my head the whole time I was just like, man, you are gonna be a sermon illustration. And because like it's unbelievable like how entitled some of the parents are because of what they think they're owed or what their kid is owed just for participating on a team. And I'm like, man, that is like how we treat Jesus sometimes. We treat Jesus as if he perpetually has to serve our needs. We when we pray to God, we're like, man, God, you got to do everything exactly how I prayed for it, in the timing I'm asking for it, with the people that are around it, and please don't ask anything of me. And then when you don't, it's your fault, God. And when you don't adhere to my needs, how can I ever believe in you, God? Right? Well, what is that? It's a consumeristic mindset. It's self-centered. We're trying to have God on our terms. Jesus said actually in verse 34, he's pulling people away from that by saying, listen, how am I fed? By doing God's will. That's how I'm fed. I'm not fed by doing what I want. I'm not fed by buying what I want. Listen, we live in a world that's like hedonistic, right? You become about all your stuff, and then what are you left with at the end of your life? Your stuff. But what Jesus says, you want full nourishment in your soul, then do the will of God. And contribute, not just consume. Contribute. And so Jesus is like pushing this. He's pushing them. He's like, this is how you do it. This is how you got to think. This is the example I'm setting. And listen, in verse 35 to 38, he starts weaving it more in there, and he's shifting their perspective that the people that contribute, sometimes you're a planter and sometimes you're a harvester. Like sometimes, listen, if on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being like you're praying with somebody, that they came to you and they said, I want to believe in Jesus and I want to pray with you about that, like we'll just call that a 10. And we all want the 10 moment. But sometimes you're the 1, and you might be a 1 for many years. We want the 10, and then the 10, even if you've ever had that moment, some people will say this, they'll be like, I led that person to Christ. I'm like, well, no. Like you prayed with them, and other things happened before you got there, right? Like, so let's peel back a little bit on that. But there's this thing, like, we want that, but listen, you might be step 1. Wouldn't it be amazing if the day that you were spending eternal life with people, that you have people come up to you and say, you didn't realize this, but when we worked together for those 6 months, you completely shifted my view on how this whole Jesus thing. You didn't even know it, but you made me take this little step. And then these other people came along, and then these other people came along. Or you were just you were part of my life for those 2 years in college, and everyone else was like doing all this, and you just set yourself apart in such a way that, like, man, like that made me think about everything just differently. You know, when we started dating and you took a stand instead of just kind of bowing down to everything else, like you just took a stand for like what you believed in, it really like pulled me in this direction. It changes everything. And so sometimes you're a planter and sometimes you're a harvester. And Jesus is trying to get them, but you will never be either one if you don't contribute. So you can't just consume and be like, you can't sit here and consume and be like, I guess I'm a planter right now. You know you're a nothinger. Right? Like you're nothing at this point. Like you're just consuming. You're just taking. And so Jesus is like, no. You want to be a planter or a harvester once you're past the exploring phase. All right, if you're exploring and you're wondering about this Jesus thing and everything, but the second you say, no, I want to do this, Jesus says, like, then get involved and start contributing to the process. The second thing is that a consumer mindset moves us towards or breeds toxic tribalism. I know this is something we don't have a problem with, but toxic tribalism isn't just a secular thing. We see this all throughout Christianity too. We see it in competition between churches, in the way that Christians talk about other Christians. And listen, this isn't just an American thing either. I mean, you see this everywhere. So this is not just here. But toxic tribalism is a part of this idea of having a consumeristic mindset. And when we think about toxic tribalism, there are a few keys around this. Toxic tribalism wants to leverage power, and Jesus wants to leverage love. So consumers who just kind of take in the Jesus thing and don't contribute in it, they're going to want to leverage power. They're going to want to leverage authority. They're going to want to dictate certain things. And they're going to say things like the only way we can make a difference is with like people in power, people that have like great impact. It's got to be a powerful thing. But Jesus teaches like the exact opposite of that. He talks about humility and patience and this word called meekness. He teaches us to love in such a way that defies all the stereotypes. There's actually a part where this guy named Paul who's writing, he says, do you know what brings people to repentance? Kindness. But we want power to make a difference. We need to be in positions of power. This week I was listening to this interview with this guy who leads one of the largest, or the largest Christian university in America. I won't mention his name. We'll just call him Larry Palwell. And he was on this interview. And listen, I'm not saying he's all bad or anything like that. But on this interview, it was really bad. I'm not saying he's not a Christian or anything like that. But I will say this: what he was saying was completely anti-Christ. In this moment, he was saying this, that the greatest enemy of Christianity right now is liberals. And that we need to get power back, take the country back from liberals, and the fight is against liberals. I'm like, first of all, it's so far off even theologically, like to talk about what our greatest battle is against, first of all. Secondly, how in the world do you match that up even when Jesus talked about loving your enemies? Like, you can't. You literally can't. You would have to do this to the entire Sermon on the Mount. You just have to go and rip it out and be like, this doesn't apply. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, this is toxic. This is toxic tribalism at its finest from the person who runs the largest Christian university in America. Now, the reverse was interesting. This guy, N.T. Wright, who's one of my favorite authors, if you like a little more heady stuff, like you should just read everything he has written. But he's an Anglican priest and over in Europe, and he's brilliant. And on the same day, or it was either the same day or the day after, that I listened to Mr. Falwell, and then I read this interview with N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright said this: when asked, are you hopeful for Christianity in this current climate? He didn't say, let's fight the liberals. Here's what he said: Jesus died and rose again. And you might think to yourself, what does that have to do with anything? And here's what he's saying. Jesus died and rose again, so he's bigger than all of this stuff. Jesus died and rose again, so it doesn't matter if I'm an optimistic or a pessimist in my emotions. It's just, I believe Jesus died and rose again, so I know the end of this story. And I'm going to live that out. So then he was asked, then what should Christians do in this toxic climate that we have around her? He goes, you know what every Christian should do? Pick up the Gospels, read them every day, and live it out. But here's what we do. In like toxic Christianity is this: we pick up the Gospels, instead of living them out, we rip them out. And we're like, we don't want that. I want to consume, or I just want to be about power. I just want to leverage other things that actually aren't Jesus. And it creates this toxicity that moves us away from actually what Jesus actually taught us. The second thing is that toxic tribalism lacks curiosity where Jesus requires it. See, these disciples step in. They're quote unquote curious in the sense of, why are you defying all the cultural norms? How this might impact me. And so that's how the disciples are entering into this scenario with Jesus and this woman. But what Jesus is saying, like, you should be curious. He sat down with this woman. Why? He was curious about her. He was curious about what it means to love her well, to interact with her and hear her perspective. And Jesus requires us to engage that way. He requires us to remain curious and to learn and to grow. Some of the things that can interrupt that are actually that we think we're more mature than we really are. I remember an email I received, it was a while ago now at this point, but someone wrote this email in and said, I'm leaving the church because I'm just past what you teach, and I'm past just kind of what this community focuses on. And I just wanted to type so many things. And so I tried to engage in conversation a little bit more about that, and the reply back was even worse kind of than what was said, and so I just replied, well, hopefully someday we'll be on your level, and that was it. That wasn't, not my finest moment, and so, but I was just like, I was having an off day, y'all, and so I did that, but once you hit send, it was gone. But in that moment, here's what you see. That sometimes we think just because we've been doing this Christianity thing for a while, we think we're mature, but we're actually incredibly immature and a child. Or we're so narcissistic, or we're so prideful, or we're so arrogant. And the end result is you become toxic within a community, in the way you view community, in the way you view what it means to share your faith and create culture and create experiences for people that would welcome people in that don't know Jesus. You know, you get away from that because you're only concerned about what you can consume and what is about you. And everything gets twisted. It becomes so toxic, and we stop being curious. I mean, even with some of these like big celebrities that are having these kind of huge faith moments right now. You know, some people get so they're immediately just like negative or pessimistic, like whether it's Kanye West or Blake Shelton or P. Diddy recently, like these guys that are having these big moments and being very vocal about their faith, and people are just like, well, that can't be right, or that can't be, or what about that? I'm like, how about we just hit pause for a second and believe that God could do something? There's a thought. He did it with you, right? So it's possible that they could do it with them. And so I just think it's important then to kind of start taking in, am I thinking in a toxic way and consuming way? Or am I a contributor in all of this stuff? And so the third thing, toxic tribalism uses fear to create a narrative. Jesus uses grace and truth. You know, you can have a personal fear, maybe built in by being in some toxic environments, and where you think maybe you're not good enough, or what if I can't do this, or what if I can't, and kind of the fear breeds into you, and that might have been put on you by somebody, just the way you were raised, or the church you went to. But there's some toxicity that can come, and you can have some personal fear around that, and that personal fear can lead to some isolation and some loneliness. And not feeling seen or known. One of the things that when we talk about the kind of environment that we want here, and are we perfect at it? No. But when we talk about this as a staff, and when we talk about this as in training people to be part of the teams, that one of the things that we want to focus on consistently is seeing people. Like taking the time to see them. Taking the time for them to be known, taking the time, like people might walk in here and their whole life they're spent alone, or a whole life people have marginalized them for one reason or another, whatever that is. But to work on like seeing, can we create a culture where people are seen and are known? Because of the fear that can be built up. You might have communal fear that ends up happening, right? You can have kind of personal, and you can have community fear, where people kind of get together and everything's like doomsday scenario. Well, if this happens, and this is going to happen, right? And to kind of create this fear narrative. This happens all the time in churches. Like, listen, come November, people are going to be using a fear narrative through churches. And let alone secular stuff. Like, in churches, you will hear this. In Christian circles, you will hear this. Depending on who you support for president, someone's going to create fear one way or the other. But you can choose to buy into that or not. Why? Because Jesus died and he rose again. So when someone's like, what if? Like, your response can be, Jesus died and rose again. Yeah, but what about, but he died and rose again. Yeah, but what if? He goes, I'm going to read the Gospels and live them out. You do what you need to do, right? But Jesus died and he rose again. And so it changes everything. rather than being this culture and this narrative of fear. That's not Christ-like. It's just the opposite. And so why? And what do we see in this woman? She has this freedom and this joy. She's not living in fear. See, when you're in a community that brings about grace and truth, you feel this unbelievable freedom and joy to live your faith out, to be who you are, to admit and confess the stage that you're in, knowing, hey, these people got me. I'm not in the best place right now, but I know I can be here. I've got a lot of questions, but I know I can ask them here. And there's this freedom and this joy that goes along with it when it's centered around grace and truth and not fear. And the last thing is this: toxic tribalism is a result of idolatry. This is actually the main point. You want to know why some of the things that we see that are so toxic? That's because of idolatry. And here's all we mean by idolatry: anything you place above God for your purpose and your identity and your hope. And listen, idolatry can rear its ugly head in so many ways. And some of them can start off as good things, and they can turn into an idol. Some of them can be bad things that are just idolatrous. Some of them can be big things that are idolatrous. But that's where it all starts. See, when we started this church, one of the things that we really focused on and still do today is that we want everyone to be involved. We don't want you to consume. Now, we want to be a part of every phase. So your phase or your stage that you might be in is exploring. We want to be a part of that with you. Ask your questions. Be a part of our community. You don't have to have everything figured out. It's totally cool. But if you're a Christian and you've been around, we want you to be involved. Why does that matter? Because when you start contributing, you start caring more. When you start caring more, it bleeds out into your life in other ways. This is not about just caring about Hill City. This is saying, man, I want to be a contributor when I'm at work. I want to be a contributor when I'm at home. I want to be a contributor when I'm in my friendships and everything else, or who I'm dating, whatever it is. You want to be a contributor in it, not just sitting idly by consuming. Because you start caring about things more. You start caring about helping people be seen and known. You start knowing your own experience and saying, hey, I want to be involved, so they might not have the same experience I did. Or you might have this opportunity to be like, man, you're telling me I get to be involved, and I might be step one in someone's process. I get to be the planter. Wait, you might say, I get to be the harvester. I get to do that too, or whatever part of the process you are, that only happens when you start getting involved. So we talk about doing the Explore class. It's 2 weeks long. You figure out what team you can serve on and what's going on here. You have opportunities to serve with kids and guest services or singing or in sound and media or community groups, the new discipleship process that we're going to have starting in March of next year. All these opportunities, the partners that we have every month. All these ways to contribute. Right at your fingertips, to be involved, to be a part of it. It changes the way you view anything. Why do you want to do that? Because Jesus died and he rose again. If this was about building Hill City, that would be dumb. This is because Jesus died and rose again, and we want to see people come to know that and believe that and follow it and contribute to it. That's the beauty. But then it starts with you and me and all of us getting involved and getting on board to do that. Well, here are 2 minutes to think questions for today to kind of wrestle with. Number 1, would you consider yourself a consumer or contributor, and why? Number 2, is it possible there's a part of you that contributes to toxic tribalism? How so? Number 3, what is one thing you can do to become more of a contributor? Let's put 2 minutes up there, then I'll come back and close this in prayer. You guys pray with me. God, I pray that we would, no matter what stage we're in, that first we would want to live a life that's not self-centered. So if there's someone here today that's in this exploring kind of stage of just wondering, what this whole Jesus thing is about, God, I just pray that you would begin to make yourself more real to them. And if they need to intellectually be challenged or have conversation and experience, whatever that is, God, that they would begin to see more of you and how real you are. For others in this room that can see themselves as maybe a little immature or lacking commitment, but believe in you, God, I pray that there would be such a deep sense of conviction to want to get involved, to want to be a contributor, to want to be part of helping shape a community that is known for just loving people and respecting people and making people be seen and having an experience of a community that's known for grace and love and truth and generosity and kindness and compassion, to be a part of that, to contribute to all of that. And for folks in here, God, that might be really mature just in terms of how long they've been a Christian. God, but I pray that we would have a renewed sense of humility that we don't know everything. A renewed sense of humility that would allow us to experience you maybe a little differently than has been the case in the past. And to begin to engage faith in a whole new way that just drives us towards a deeper love of you. So God, we just thank you that the reason we want to do all this is because you died and you rose again. And that gives us the ultimate hope. It gives us the ultimate purpose. It gives us a reason to be and to love people the way that you've taught us to love. So God, I pray that that will be on the forefront of our minds and deep in the core of our hearts to experience you more. In your name we pray, everybody said. Amen. If you'd like prayer for anything in your life, we've got folks over here waiting to pray with you. It would be an honor for them to do so. If you would want to get connected here, whether that's finding out a team to serve on or whatever, please stop by the lounge area. There are people there waiting to talk with you about how you can get connected and where to serve and everything. There's some different ways to do that. Our partner spotlight, because of your generosity, it's been a good run of generosity with the share offering and just how we're ending this year. But you guys are such an incredibly generous grouping of people. And so thank you so much for how you consistently give. And one of our partners, Virginia Kids Belong, has been recipients of that generosity. And they're our partner spotlight for this month. And they work with the business sector, faith sector, and government sector in our communities to come to end the crisis of foster care. And they have all these different ways you can actually foster a child, or there are different ways to just support families and people working in that system. And so if you want to learn more about that and get involved, please stop by and talk to them on your way out. And the last thing I just want to remind you, Christmas Eve is very soon. And so we'll have a normal Sunday service next week. And then Christmas Eve will be Monday the 23rd at 7 o'clock. And then Tuesday at 11, 4, and 6 o'clock. If you have not gone to christmasandrva.com yet, and just when we say reserve your spot or get your ticket, that's just letting us know that you're coming. You don't have to have a ticket to come in or anything like that. It's just letting us know kind of the breakdown of the services, and it just helps us prepare well. If you've not done that, please go do that. And when you register, just let us know how many people you're bringing. Right now, the busiest service is going to be 4 o'clock. Okay, and if that's the one you come to, that's fine. You come to whatever one, we'll jam people in. It's not a big deal. But the service that has the most room right now would be the 6 o'clock one. So if you do have flexibility, choose the 6 o'clock. And we also have ways, if you want to serve at any of those services, and maybe you haven't started serving yet, we've got ways to do that too. So please just let us know. Thank you guys. Love you all. We'll see you all next Sunday.